Hi, it's Katrina. My friend David is going to be helping me out with the voiceover today, so I hope you enjoy.
Number 10. The Dark Ages of Obscurantism. The Catholic Church may have been responsible for the rise of the Dark Ages at the end of the 4th century. It was around this time that Rome stopped supporting pagan religions and Christianity was embraced. They then proceeded to destroy all remnants of pagan culture in Europe. Everyone had to be Christian or they would have to face the consequences. While this may not seem so bad, it did end up leading to one of the darkest ages in human history. Within just a few decades, the Church had brought in an era of obscurantism. But what in the world is obscurantism? Well, obscurantism is the practice of deliberately preventing facts and details of something from being known. In other words, willful misdirection. In religious terms, obscurantism prevents enlightenment. The Catholic Church did this by stunting scientific growth and dumbing down the population. They also kept everyone, except for the topmost levels of the clergy, illiterate. Prior to the Dark Ages, many people could read and write. It was just a common thing that people did. But once the Church had taken over Europe, not even monks knew how to read. They simply looked at the words in their Bibles and believed they were holy symbols from God. Sure, there were barbarian hordes ravaging Europe during the Dark Ages, but the main source of turmoil for most people were the strict orders of obedience and authority imposed on them by the Catholic Church up until around the 1500s. That was when their corruption became so severe that the people began to resist. Number 9. Giordano Bruno. Giordano Bruno lived during a time when the Christian Church actively fought against scientific progress. He was born in Italy in early 1548, and over the course of his lifetime he became a respected philosopher, mathematician, and cosmological theorist. He's known these days specifically for his theories on the universe. He was one of the first people to propose that stars in the sky were each surrounded by their own planets. He was also one of the very first vocal supporters of alien life. It was Giordano's belief that each star was in its own galaxy, complete with its own planets and its own unique forms of life. He was also brave enough to insist that the universe is an infinite void with no center. These views and ideas were radical back in the 1500s, and yet they were 100% correct. Sadly for Giordano Bruno, the Roman Inquisition was not a big fan of his wild theories. They didn't like the idea of other life forms existing and were adamant that the Earth was the center of the universe. Bruno was charged with heresy for his denial of core Catholic doctrines. The Church also hated that Bruno taught others about the theory of transmigration of the soul, or more simply put, reincarnation. Unfortunately, on January 20th, 1600, the Inquisition found Bruno guilty on all charges, and he was consequently sentenced to death. The secular authorities hung him upside down and brutally burned him at the stake on February 17th of that same year. Bruno's ashes were then thrown into the Tiber River. Number 8. Selling indulgence. During the Middle Ages, it was taught by the Catholic Church that if you sinned in life, you would be punished in the afterlife. But to avoid a brutal punishment, you could pay a small sum of money. This was called an indulgence, and it was used by the Catholic Church as a way to scam people out of their hard-earned cash. Church officials would take payments from a sinner, promising that their money would convince God not to punish them so severely for the nasty things they did while they were alive. An individual who received an indulgence from the Church would have to activate it by saying a specific prayer a certain number of times. Either that, or they would be ordered to go on a pilgrimage, which meant visiting somewhere like a church or cemetery in order to perform good works. By the time the late Middle Ages had arrived, the Church was severely abusing their system of indulgences. The Church was making so much money from scamming people that it became a business. The Church tried to rectify the problem, but it wasn't able to reverse the damage that had been done. It was this widespread corruption that ultimately led to the Protestant Reformation. It wasn't until the 20th century that reforms in the Catholic Church abolished indulgences. Instead of paying to have your sins removed, you simply had to spend time in penance, although at the beginning people confused penance with purgatory. This led to widespread panic and outrage. People believed the Church expected them to do time in purgatory as if they were going to prison in the afterlife for their sins. Number 7. Medieval taxes. The church dominated everybody's life in medieval England. Everyone from the village idiot to the town mayor believed that God, heaven, purgatory, and hell existed. They were also taught that the only way to get into heaven was through the Roman Catholic Church. People were terrified of going to hell, as if it were a real place that they would be dragged to against their will. This fear led to easy manipulation and heavy taxation. The tithe was how the church really milked the ordinary people for as much as they could. Despite the hardships of medieval England, everyone paid 10% of their total annual earnings to the church. It could be paid in either money or produced goods. If a peasant didn't have cash, they could pay in harvested grain or chickens. The peasants were informed that if they refused to pay the tithe, they would go to hell. They didn't even need to be threatened with physical violence. Hell was a big enough motivator. The church made so much money from taxing everyone that King Henry VIII reformed it. He got rid of the Roman Catholic Church and established the Church of England so that he could be in control of the tax money. And that was the beginning of the English government squeezing taxes from the people. Number 6. The First Crusade. Pope Urban II may have been the worst pope in church history. The speech he made on November 22, 1095, was certainly one of the most influential, but it was also disastrous. Pope Urban II called to arms all the men in Europe that were capable of fighting. He urged all Christians with 2 arms and 2 legs to fight back against the Muslims in order to reclaim the Holy Land. He convinced the people with 3 words: God wills it. The Pope insisted that any Christian man who fought against the Muslims for their God would be granted a place in heaven, regardless of their sins. He essentially gave everyone permission to commit atrocities so long as they were fighting for God, and this was the beginning of the Crusades. The conflict had been going on already for almost 500 years. The European Christians had been visiting Jerusalem ever since the 6th century, when it was taken over by Muslim forces. But in the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks took control of Jerusalem and banned Christians from entering the city. They then threatened to take Constantinople and to destroy the Byzantine Empire, and that was when Pope Urban interfered. The Pope used the opportunity to unite Europe under a Christian banner, underneath his supreme authority. It was a major power move on his part, and it likely had very little to do with God. The motivation behind many soldiers going to fight in Jerusalem was far from holy. European nobles were enticed by the prospect of new riches and increased land holdings. Greed from every angle resulted in a bloody war that raged for the next 2 centuries. Do you think anything could have been done to prevent corruption from taking over the church? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. Number 5. Ramirez of Cambray. Ramirez of Cambray was one of the first men in recorded history who was accused of heresy and burned alive. He is considered the first man in Europe to have been burned at the stake as a martyr. His story starts in the middle of the 11th century. He was a local priest who practiced his own version of Christianity. In 1067, when other priests tried to force him to accept communion, he refused. The bishop summoned Ramirez to court because he claimed the church's priesthood was corrupt. Ramirez then refused to accept the sacrament, and that was when things quickly turned violent. Since this was over 1,000 years ago, it's unclear exactly what happened. Most historical records point to an angry mob being responsible for the man's execution. After Ramirez refused to take the sacrament and was deemed a heretic, he was put in a small hut and kept prisoner. The mob then took him from the hut and tied him up before burning him as a heretic. Number 4. Thomas Beckett. Thomas Beckett, or St. Thomas of Canterbury, was a 12th century chancellor, born around the year 1120. He was the son of a wealthy merchant in London, and he grew up well educated, so he quickly climbed through the ranks of the church. He became an agent to Theobald, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and was sent on various missions to Rome. King Henry II soon took notice of Thomas and made him his personal chancellor. They became close friends, and when Theobald died in 1161, the king gave the position of Archbishop to Thomas. At this point, the relationship between the Archbishop and the king was amiable, but over time, things started to sour. It soon became clear to Henry that Thomas was not going to put up with his meddling in the church. Thomas was a shockingly good and decent archbishop, and the king didn't like that at all. King Henry was able to buy off the loyalty of the other clerics in the church, especially the higher English clergy. Thomas Becket was the only holdout, even refusing to sign documents that would give King Henry more power over the church. The king soon grew tired of fighting with Thomas and instead planned to get rid of him once and for all. Realizing the precarious situation he was in, Thomas fled to France to live in exile. He returned in 1170, only to be murdered by supporters of the king who showed up to Canterbury Cathedral. Thomas, who may have been one of the only honest archbishops in English history, was killed for not being corrupt enough. Number 3. Poorly behaved monks. In July of 1531, John Longland, the Bishop of Lincoln, was charged with creating a tribunal to investigate rumors of poorly behaved monks. When John arrived at the Augustinian Abbey of Missenden in Buckinghamshire, he discovered nothing but bad behavior. Shortly after his arrival, John found out that the local canon, Robert Palmer, was having relations with a married woman named Margaret Bishop. To escape blame, the canon tried to blame the adultery on the abbot, John Fox. The abbot himself was already accused of nepotism, financial fraud, and possibly even impregnating his own sister. At the end of the inquiry, John sentenced Palmer to prison and suspended the abbot from office. This was very near to the time when the monasteries in England started to get dissolved. Ever since the 13th century, morality police had been exposing indiscretions across the British Isles. Monks and other church officials were found guilty of lewd behavior and negligence. They were also accused of sleeping during church service and public playing of dice. You didn't even need to be a member of clergy to be caught slighting God. In 1442, a man named Richard Gray was busted for getting a Benedictine nun pregnant at St. Michael's Priory in Stamford. He was found guilty of spiritual incest and was ordered to be flogged on the next 4 Sundays while walking through the church, dressed only in his linens. Number 2. Pope John XII. Octavianus of Spoleto was around 17 years old when he ascended to the papacy and became Pope John XII on December 16, 955 AD. Perhaps because of his youth, or maybe because he was granted the papal throne due to politics and ungodliness, he became one of the most infamous popes in history. His corruption was so severe that he's still talked about today as the demon that infiltrated the highest place in the church. His father was Alberic II of Spoleto, the effective ruler of the Papal States. His mother was either an obscure mistress or Alberic's wife, who also happened to be his stepsister. Whatever the case may be, Octavianus became the most powerful teenager in the world, seemingly overnight. As soon as he held the throne, he immediately began to make some extremely questionable decisions. Pope John XII ordained a 10-year-old as bishop, which was part of a larger problem of selling titles within the church to the highest bidder. He once ordained a deacon in a horse stable. He was accused of having relations with his father's mistress, presumably not the same woman who may have been his mother, and he had relations with his niece, as well as multiple widows. Oh, and he was also a bit of a murderer. He allegedly blinded and killed a man, then castrated and murdered a subdeacon. This was the despicable state of the church until Pope John's death in 964 AD. His demise came after he was caught sleeping with a married woman. When her husband found out, he murdered the Pope. Number 1. The 40 Martyrs of England and Wales. The English Reformation was a brutal time for England. It began in the early 16th century with King Henry separating from the Roman Catholic Church. England moved out from under the authority of the Pope, and it was not an easy transition. Between 1535 and 1679, tens of thousands of people lost their lives. The 40 Martyrs of England and Wales are one of the more famous groups of people that were executed for breaking newly enacted laws during the Reformation. The group includes the Carthusian monks who declined King Henry's Act of Supremacy in 1535 and were killed. The Act of Supremacy established the English monarch as the head of the church instead of the Pope. All those who didn't agree, like the Carthusian monks, were murdered. 34 of the victims were hanged before they were chopped into 4 pieces. The other 6 were killed in various ways. The last executions were the seminary priests who were allegedly caught trying to assassinate Charles II in 1679. What do you think was the worst thing the church did in the Dark Ages? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye!